Hello everyone. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to imagine something very simple. Imagine sitting alone in a quiet room, with no noise, no notifications, and no one asking you to be strong. There is just you and your thoughts. There was a time in my life when silence felt unbearable, not because it was loud, but because it revealed everything I had been trying not to feel. My name is Clara, and for many years I believed I was strong. I believed I was independent. I believed I knew exactly who I was. But strength, as I understood it back then, meant control. It meant not crying in front of others. It meant continuing to function even when something inside was collapsing. It meant smiling at work while your chest felt heavy and answering messages politely while your heart felt shattered. 3 years ago, I went through a breakup. People often describe breakups as endings. But what I experienced did not feel like an ending. It felt like an exposure. The relationship had lasted for years. We built routines together, shared plans, and shared dreams. Somewhere along the way, I built my identity around being us. I didn't notice it happening because it was gradual, subtle, almost invisible. I adjusted my schedule, my preferences, even my silence. Little by little, I became someone who was easy to love. But I stopped asking whether I loved who I was becoming when the relationship ended. People told me, "You'll be fine, and time heals everything." I nodded, thanked them, and agreed. But inside, I felt something I couldn't name. It wasn't just sadness or loneliness. It was disorientation. I no longer knew who I was without that relationship. I had spent so long being part of something that I didn't know how to stand alone. The first weeks after the breakup were strangely calm. I continued working, met friends, laughed at jokes, and told people I was focusing on myself. Yet at night, when everything slowed down, the weight returned, not dramatically or violently, just steadily. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations and moments I could have handled differently. Words I could have said more gently. Silences I had misunderstood. I tried to analyze everything, as if understanding the reasons would remove the pain. But at one evening, something shifted. There was no dramatic breakdown, no screaming, no cinematic music. I was simply sitting on the kitchen floor with the lights off in a quiet room, too tired to pretend anymore. The tears came without permission, not loud or desperate, just steady. I remember thinking, I am not okay, and for the first time, I did not try to correct that thought. I didn't say, "But I will be fine," or "Others have it worse," or "This is temporary." I simply allowed the truth to exist. I am not okay. That sentence felt terrifying, but it also felt honest. And honest, even painful honesty, is a strange kind of relief. That night, something opened inside me. I realized I had spent years suppressing discomfort, believing that being mature meant being composed, and that being strong meant being silent about pain. But sitting there on the kitchen floor, I understood something different. I was not breaking down. I was breaking open. Breaking open means you can no longer contain what you have been hiding. It means the walls you built to protect yourself begin to crack, and through those cracks, light and pain enter at the same time. The days that followed were not easier. If anything, they were heavier. Once you allow yourself to feel, you cannot easily return to numbness. I began noticing how exhausted I was, not just from the breakup, but from years of emotional control, from constantly trying to be the reasonable one, the patient one, the understanding one. I had learned to avoid conflict, to adjust quickly, to apologize first, and to minimize my needs. I called it compromise, but sometimes it was self-erasure. That realization hurt more than the breakup itself, because it forced me to see how much of myself I had abandoned. Healing did not begin with inspiration. It began with awareness and uncomfortable questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I actually want? What do I feel when I am not trying to be impressive, calm, or agreeable? For a long time, I didn't have answers, only silence. Silence used to scare me, but now it began to feel necessary. I started small. I stopped pretending I was fine. When friends asked how I was doing, I said, "I'm having a hard time," not dramatically or to gain sympathy, just honestly. and something surprising happened. They did not see me as weak. They saw me as real. I cried more than I thought I would in the shower, on walks, while listening to songs that suddenly felt too meaningful. Each tear felt like a release, as if something heavy was slowly dissolving. I began to understand that emotions are not enemies. They are messengers. Sadness told me I had loved deeply. Anger told me I had ignored my boundaries. Disappointment told me I had expected too much from someone who could not give it. Confusion told me I had built my identity around something unstable. Instead of pushing these feelings away, I began sitting with them. At first, it was uncomfortable. My instinct was to distract myself, to scroll, to watch something, to call someone, but sometimes I stayed. I let the feeling exist without fixing it, and in that staying, something softened. Healing, I realized, is not about eliminating pain. It is about learning how to hold it without collapsing. I started writing in a journal, not poetic entries or dramatic reflections, just honest sentences. I feel lost. I feel angry. I feel small. Seeing those words on paper made them less frightening. They became tangible and understandable, and slowly, patterns appeared. I noticed how often I prioritized being loved over being authentic. How often I silenced myself to avoid tension, and how often I confused peace with suppression. These realizations were not comfortable, but they were clarifying. I understood then that the breakup was not just an ending. It was an invitation to rebuild myself, not around someone else's expectations, but around my own truth. That rebuilding would take time. It would not be dramatic or fast, but it would be real. At that stage, I did not know who I was becoming. I only knew that I could no longer return to who I had been, and that quiet, fragile awareness became the beginning of my journey of healing and growth. After the first wave of emotions settled, life did not suddenly become clear. There was no dramatic transformation, no morning when I woke up feeling reborn and completely at peace. Instead, there was only a quiet awareness that I could no longer live the way I had before. Letting go sounds simple when people say it. They say, you just have to move on, as if it is a switch you can flip in a single moment. But letting go is not a single act. It is a practice, a repeated choice you make again and again, especially on the days when it feels hardest. Some days, letting go meant not checking old messages. Other days it meant resisting the urge to imagine different endings, or rewrite conversations in my mind. Sometimes, it meant allowing memories to surface, without trying to change them, without trying to turn them into something softer or more acceptable. I realized that I had been holding on to more than a person. I had been holding on to an identity, the version of myself who was chosen, the version of myself who was needed, the version of myself who felt secure simply because someone else was there. Without that identity, I felt undefined. And being undefined is deeply uncomfortable. We are taught to know who we are, to introduce ourselves confidently, to describe our goals and dreams with clarity. Yet I found myself in a space where I could not clearly answer simple questions. What do you want? What makes you happy? What matters to you? For a while, I avoided those questions because they felt too large and too demanding. But avoiding them only made the emptiness louder. So I began with smaller ones. What makes me feel calm? What makes me feel tense? Who do I feel like when I am alone? I started paying attention to subtle reactions. The tightness in my chest when I agreed to something I did not want. The quiet relief when I said no. The warmth I felt when I spoke honestly, even if my voice trembled. These were small signals, almost invisible from the outside, but they were honest. Slowly, I began to understand that healing is not about becoming stronger than your pain. It is about becoming more attentive to yourself. There were moments when I felt the urge to rush forward, to find someone new, to distract myself with endless activity, to prove that I was moving on. But something inside me resisted that speed. It whispered, stay with the discomfort, stay with the uncertainty, stay with yourself. That whisper became my guide. Instead of filling every evening with noise, I allowed quiet to exist. I read books that asked difficult questions. I took long walks without music. I sat with a cup of tea and let my thoughts wander freely. At first, these moments felt empty, almost unsettling. but gradually they felt grounding. I realized that for years I had avoided solitude, not because I disliked being alone, but because being alone forced me to face myself. Now, solitude began to feel like space to rebuild. Letting go also meant releasing expectations, not only about the relationship, but about who I was supposed to be. I had built an image of myself as someone always composed, always kind, always understanding. Yet I had ignored parts of me that were frustrated, ambitious, sensitive, and opinionated. Healing required me to welcome those parts back, not to let them control me, but to let them exist without shame. I remember one specific moment during a conversation with a friend. She asked me what I truly wanted in a future relationship. Without thinking, I began describing what would make someone else comfortable. She paused and gently said, "That sounds like what you think you should want. What do you actually want?" Her question startled me because I did not know. In that instant, I realized I had shaped my desires around compatibility rather than authenticity. I wanted peace, but I had confused peace with silence. I wanted stability, but I had confused stability with predictability. I wanted love, but I had confused love with approval. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing, because once you see your patterns, you can begin to change them. I started practicing boundaries, not dramatic or aggressive ones, just honest ones. Saying, "I don't feel comfortable with that." Saying, "I need time to think." Saying, "That hurt me." Each sentence felt heavy at first, as if I were breaking an invisible rule. But each time I spoke honestly, I felt more grounded, less fragile, more solid within myself. Healing also meant forgiving myself for staying too long, for ignoring red flags, for shrinking, for blaming myself for things that were never entirely my responsibility. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is releasing the constant self-criticism that keeps you trapped in the past. I began speaking to myself differently. When I felt weak, I no longer said, "You should be stronger." Instead, I said, "You are learning." When I felt lonely, I stopped telling myself, "You are incomplete," and started saying, "You are growing." This shift was subtle but powerful. Some nights were still heavy, and memories still appeared without warning, but they no longer destroyed me. They passed through me like waves that rise and fall. Around this time, something unexpected happened. English began to reappear in my life, not as a goal or an obligation, but as curiosity. I started listening to English podcasts while walking. At first, I understood only part of what was said, but I enjoyed the rhythm, the tone, the pauses. There was something about listening in another language that required presence. I could not drift away. I had to focus. I had to stay, and staying became a metaphor for my healing. In English, I could not speak quickly or react automatically. I had to search for words, and in that searching, I slowed down. I noticed how different I felt when speaking in English, less defensive, more careful, more thoughtful, because I could not rely on habit. I had to choose my words intentionally. That practice began influencing how I spoke in my own language. I paused more, reacted less, and listened longer. English became more than a language. It became a mirror. It showed me that imperfection is acceptable, that you can speak imperfectly and still be understood, that you can hesitate and still belong in the conversation. This lesson reached beyond language. I stopped waiting to be fully healed before living again. I allowed myself to participate in life while still healing. I allowed joy to return in small ways. A morning when I woke up and felt neutral instead of heavy. An afternoon when I laughed without forcing it. An evening when I felt calm, alone. These moments did not announce themselves as progress, but they were. Gradually, I felt less defined by the breakup, less identified with loss, and more curious about possibility. Healing was no longer about recovering who I used to be. It was about discovering who I could become. For the first time in a long time, that discovery felt gentle, not urgent, not pressured, just open. I did not know where this path would lead, but I knew I was walking it with more awareness, more honesty, and more intention, and that was enough to continue. There comes a quiet stage in healing when the pain is no longer sharp, but the lessons are still unfolding, and that was where I found myself. I was no longer collapsing at night, no longer replaying every memory in endless loops. Yet I was also not fully certain of who I was becoming. It felt like standing in an open field after a storm. The sky had cleared and the air was calmer, but the ground was still soft beneath my feet. I understood then that healing, by itself, was not enough. Healing had helped me release what hurt. Now I needed to build something new. Not a new relationship, not a new identity for others to admire, but a new relationship with myself. For years, I had measured my worth by how needed I was, how dependable, how agreeable, how easy to love. Now I began asking different questions. Who am I when I am not trying to be chosen? Who am I when I am not adjusting to fit someone else's comfort? The answers did not arrive all at once. They revealed themselves quietly through daily decisions. I began to choose differently. When I felt tired, I rested without guilt. When I disagreed, I spoke without apology. When I felt joy, I allowed it without questioning whether I deserved it. These shifts were small, almost invisible from the outside, but they changed the texture of my days. I started noticing how often I used to override my intuition, a subtle discomfort, a quiet hesitation, a feeling that something was not aligned. Before, I ignored those signals. Now, I listened. Listening did not mean acting dramatically or making sudden changes. It meant acknowledging what I felt instead of dismissing it. This simple practice deepened my self-trust. Is not loud and it does not demand attention. It grows quietly every time you honor your own truth. There were still moments of doubt when I questioned whether I had overreacted in the past, whether I had been too sensitive, too emotional, or too demanding. But instead of criticizing myself, I became curious. Why did that hurt me? What boundary was crossed? What need was unmet? Curiosity gradually replaced judgment, and curiosity created space for growth. Around this time, English became more present in my life again, not as a distraction or an escape, but as expansion. I enrolled in an online course, and at first I was nervous. Speaking in another language exposed my limitations. My mistakes were visible, and my hesitation obvious. Yet something unexpected happened. In English, I could not rely on the persona I had built in my native language. I could not hide behind quick responses or polished expressions. I had to slow down, choose my words carefully, and accept imperfection publicly. Instead of feeling ashamed, I felt strangely free. When you are speaking imperfectly, there is no room for pretending. You are simply present. There were moments when I forgot a word and paused. Instead of apologizing repeatedly, I learned to breathe, to say, "Let me think," and to trust that the conversation would continue. And it did. People waited. People listened. No one judged me as harshly as I judged myself. That realization softened something inside me. I had long believed that mistakes would reduce my value, but in truth, mistakes revealed my humanity. This lesson extended beyond language. I stopped expecting myself to respond perfectly in emotional situations. I allowed pauses and incomplete thoughts. I allowed space before drawing conclusions. English taught me that clarity often comes after speaking, not before. You shape your understanding through expression and refine meaning through dialogue, and in that process, you grow. I began to see growth not as achievement but as alignment between what I felt and what I said, between what I valued and how I lived. I evaluated my relationships differently. I no longer measured them by how long they had lasted or how stable they appeared, but by how authentic I felt within them. Did I feel safe expressing discomfort? Did I feel heard? Did I feel like myself? These questions reshaped my standards. Some connections faded naturally, not because of conflict, but because I no longer fit the version of myself they were built around. That realization was bittersweet. Growth sometimes requires release, not out of anger, but out of evolution. At the same time, new connections formed people who appreciated depth, respected pauses, and did not rush vulnerability. Conversations felt different when I was not performing, when I was not trying to impress or avoid conflict. They felt lighter, not superficial, but sincere. I was no longer trying to be impressive. I was trying to be honest. And honesty, even when imperfect, created stronger foundations. There were evenings when I reflected on how far I had come, not dramatically or with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement. I no longer saw the breakup as something that happened to me. I saw it as something that revealed me. It exposed patterns I needed to examine, forced me to meet parts of myself I had neglected, and invited me into deeper awareness. I came to understand that growth is not glamorous. It is repetitive and daily. It is choosing differently in small moments, resisting old habits when they feel comfortable, pausing when reacting would be easier, and speaking when silence would feel safer. Some days I still felt vulnerable. Old fears surfaced, the fear of being misunderstood, of being abandoned, of not being enough. But these fears no longer controlled me. They informed me. They showed me where attention was needed. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, to breathe through uncertainty instead of rushing decisions, and to accept that clarity unfolds gradually. English remained part of this unfolding. Every new word I learned felt symbolic, not because vocabulary itself changed my life, but because it represented expansion. Each imperfect sentence was proof that I was willing to try, willing to sound unsure, willing to be seen learning. And learning, I realized, is the opposite of stagnation. There was a time when my life felt paused. Now it felt in motion, not fast or dramatic, but intentional. I was no longer waiting for healing to end. I was living while healing continued, and that distinction changed everything. Growth did not erase my past. It integrated it. It allowed me to look back without collapsing, to remember without reliving, to appreciate without clinging. I became softer with myself, more patient and more grounded. Not because I had eliminated pain, but because I had learned to hold it gently. The field after the storm no longer felt unstable. The ground beneath me felt firmer. For the first time in a long while, I felt aligned, not perfect, and not certain about every detail of my future, but aligned with myself. And that alignment marked the beginning of something deeper, something quieter, and something lasting. There was a time when I believed healing had an endpoint, a clear destination where I would finally feel completely whole, completely certain, completely untouched by what once hurt me. I imagined there would be a moment when the past would no longer echo inside me, when old memories would lose their weight entirely. But as the months passed, I began to understand something different. Healing does not end. It integrates. It becomes part of how you move through life, part of how you respond, part of how you see yourself and the world. There are still days when old memories surface, still days when loneliness whispers softly, still moments when I question myself. The difference now is not the absence of those feelings. It is my response to them. I no longer panic when discomfort appears, and I no longer rush to fix it. I pause, I breathe, I stay. Staying used to feel dangerous because it meant facing emotions I feared would overwhelm me. Now it feels powerful. Staying means I trust myself enough not to escape. I trust that I can sit with uncertainty without collapsing. That I can feel sadness without being defined by it. That I can experience doubt without losing direction. The most unexpected part of this journey has been discovering that growth is quiet. It does not announce itself, and there is no applause or dramatic transformation that others immediately recognize. Sometimes growth looks like choosing not to send a message when you feel triggered. Sometimes it looks like ending a conversation calmly instead of defensively, admitting you were wrong, or saying I don't know without shame. These moments are small, almost invisible, but they accumulate, and over time they reshape who you are. I no longer see myself as someone who simply survived heartbreak. I see myself as someone who learned to meet herself, to listen inwardly, to respond intentionally, and to live with awareness. There was a subtle shift that marked this deeper stage of growth. I stopped asking, when will I feel ready? Ready for love, ready for change, ready for the next chapter of my life. Instead, I began asking, am I present? Presence replaced readiness, because readiness is a feeling that may never fully arrive, while presence is a choice I can make now. English continued to grow alongside this shift. It was no longer just something I practiced in private. It became something I participated in. I began speaking more, joining conversations, and making mistakes openly. At times I felt exposed, but exposure no longer terrified me. It reminded me that growth requires visibility. When I spoke imperfect English, I was reminded of something essential. Fluency is not the beginning of participation. Participation is the beginning of fluency. The same was true for life. Clarity is not required before you act. Action creates clarity. Waiting to be perfect keeps you silent, while speaking, even imperfectly, creates connection. English taught me to tolerate awkwardness, to search patiently for words, and to allow pauses without panic. That tolerance slowly spilled into every area of my life. I became more comfortable with silence in conversations, more patient during misunderstandings, and more open to perspectives different from my own. Language became more than communication. It became a practice of humility, of listening, of staying engaged even when unsure. Looking back now, I see that the breakup was not the central story. The central story was awakening to my patterns, to my avoidance, to my longing for authenticity. Healing did not erase the past. It redefined it. It allowed me to see that pain is not punishment. It is information. It tells you what matters, what needs attention, and where growth is waiting. There was a time when I lived on the surface of my own life, busy, functional, stable, but disconnected. Now my life may not look dramatically different from the outside. I still work, manage responsibilities, and move through ordinary routines. But internally, everything feels different. I am not drifting. I am choosing. Choosing to listen, choosing to pause, choosing to speak, choosing to remain present even when it would be easier to retreat. I no longer measure my growth by external milestones, not by relationship status, not by achievements, and not by how calm I appear. I measure it by alignment. Am I living in a way that reflects what I value? Am I responding instead of reacting? Am I honest with myself? Some days the answer is yes, and some days it is not, and that is okay because growth is not linear. It is cyclical. It revisits old themes at deeper levels and invites you to practice the same lesson in new contexts. The difference now is that I do not fear those cycles. I trust them. I trust that each return carries deeper understanding and deeper compassion. Recently, during a quiet evening, I realized something simple. I was sitting alone again, in silence. But this time the silence did not feel heavy. It felt spacious. I noticed my breathing and the steadiness of my thoughts. They were not racing or demanding. They were calm. I felt at home inside myself. That feeling did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic revelation. It arrived gently, like sunlight slowly filling a room. In that moment, I understood something profound. Healing did not give me a new life. It gave me a new way of living the life I already had. English, in its own quiet way, became part of that living. Each word learned, each sentence spoken, each hesitation survived, symbolized willingness to participate, to risk imperfection, to grow publicly. If you are listening to this and feel like you are still in the early stages of your own healing, I want to say gently that there is no timeline, no perfect pace, and no correct way to move through pain. There is only attention and intention. If you are feeling heavy, that does not mean you are failing. It may mean something inside you is asking to be seen. If you feel lost, that does not mean you are broken. It may mean you are between identities, between versions of yourself, and that space, though uncomfortable, is fertile. Growth does not require you to become someone else. It asks you to become more honest, more aware, and more present. Language, like healing, is not about perfection. It is about participation, about showing up, about staying in the conversation even when you are unsure. I still make mistakes in English, in relationships, and in daily decisions. But I no longer see mistakes as evidence of inadequacy. I see them as movement, and movement as life. My journey of healing and growth is not complete. It is ongoing, quiet, intentional, and deeply human. I no longer wait for my life to begin. I am living it, imperfectly and presently, one breath, one word, one choice at a time. And that, for me, is enough.